Morning guys, and welcome to another video. In today's video we're going to be having a look at two of my favourite cameras and doing a bit of a shootout between the two. Now, friends of the channel will know that I absolutely love this, the Fuji X100V. I think this is one of the best everyday cameras that you can buy for the money. But what if the money element didn't matter so much? How about the Leica Q? So recently I picked up the Leica Q because somebody wanted to swap it for my Leica M240 and I couldn't help myself. These two cameras, although they're very different in price, I think hit the same kind of target market. Now we're going to talk about price now so that we can just get it out of the way. This camera costs about £2,000 and the X100V costs about £1,000. So this camera is twice as expensive as the X100V. Is it twice as good? Probably not. Not for most people, but that's not the point of this video. We're going to kind of assume that you don't really care about the money element and you're just comparing the two cameras. So that's it when it comes to cost. So I think what we're going to do then with this video is we're going to split into four different sections. First up, we're going to talk about the build and quality of these two cameras. We're then going to have a look at performance because at the end of the day, that's what a lot of us need from our cameras. One's full frame but quite old, one of them's modern and an APS-C sensor, so which one is actually better? We're then going to have a little look at kind of outputs as well because I think both Leica and Fujifilm camera shooters both think that their JPEGs are the best, but we'll have a little bit of a play around with those later too. And then we're going to finally finish on just other. There's going to be a few things that don't really fit into one of those three categories. I'm going to timestamp a whole bunch of stuff up on the screen now because I think this video is going to be a pretty long one. So first up then, let's talk build quality. Now when it comes down to these two cameras, they're actually surprisingly hard to compare. Now the main reason for that is these two cameras follow two very different design philosophies. You've got the Leica Q, even though it's the older camera, feels a little bit more modern with its kind of sleek approach, minimalistic design. You've then got the X100V that feels a little bit more rugged maybe and kind of harks back to older times with a few more physical controls. But if we move away from the subjective, there is a pretty big difference between these two cameras. The Leica Q isn't weather sealed and the X100V is. Now for some people that might be an instant deal breaker for the Q. Now a lot of people do say they take these cameras out in the rain and they're fine, but there is definitely a difference. You can see the seals around the doors of the X100V and the Q just doesn't have them. Now the Q2 does have weather sealing, but you're going to pay a couple grand for the privilege. There is kind of one caveat to the weather sealing on the X100V though, and that's the fact that you need to have an adapter on the front of the camera, because as it is right now in my hand, this camera is not weather sealed as water can get in around the lens. You need to have an adapter and a filter on the front for it actually to be weather sealed, but I think it's really nice to have that option. If you're somebody that loves customizing your camera, then the X100V is probably the clear winner here. When it comes to customization of buttons and controls, the X100V has just got an awful lot more going for it. On the Q you can do a couple of different buttons. I think there's a button on the front and there's also the dial on the top. I personally set the top dial to exposure compensation because I love it. It's one of my favorite features, but it's going to be pretty tough to customize much beyond that. So it's kind of subjective. Do you like button controls? Do you not? I barely use any custom buttons to be honest, so for me personally it makes very little difference. Now there is one thing about both these cameras that they have in common, and it's very, very desirable for a lot of people, and that's the fact that both of these cameras have a leaf shutter inside of them. Leaf shutters give you two advantages. The first one is that both of these cameras are exceptionally quiet in terms of operation, and that's one of the big pros of leaf shutters, and an awful lot of street photographers like it because you can kind of be a little bit more undercover than you can with some other cameras. The second thing that's really good about having a leaf shutter is super fast flash sync speeds. Now I personally do not do any flash photography, so I'm not going to be the best person to tell you in terms of like what you can do with it and what you can achieve with it, but the extra thing with the X100V is it does have a built-in flash, although if you're really into flash photography you've probably got your own flash guns. But one last trick that the X100V has up its sleeve, and that is the fact that it has a built-in ND filter. The ND filter I think is a 4-stop filter, and it's really good if you want to still be shooting at f2 in really bright sunny conditions. I guess the only thing is with the Q, it can still get away with shooting at f1.7 in really, really bright sunlight. So I guess both cameras can still shoot with nice creamy backgrounds, but the ND in the X100V does give you that little bit more creative freedom for things like long exposures in bright conditions. One last trick up the sleeve of the X100V is its viewfinder. It's got three different settings. There's an optical viewfinder, a hybrid viewfinder, and an EVF, like you'd typically expect on a camera like this. If you like the optical viewfinder, then you're going to like the X100V. Personally, I don't find myself using it all that much, and I revert to the EVF. The EVF on the Leica Q was one of the best EVFs when it came out, and it still stands up very well today. So next up then, let's talk about performance, and we'll kick off with the lenses on the front of these two cameras. Now the lens on the front of the Leica Q is a 28mm f1.7, and the lens on the front of the Fuji is a f2, and it's a 23mm, but it's actually a 35mm in terms of full frame equivalent. So these two cameras have two different frame lengths. So for a lot of the photos you're going to see in this video, I've actually put the wide angle converter on the X100V just so that we've got two matching focal lengths, and it kind of takes something out of the comparison. When it comes down to performance, I guess the big thing here is we've got full frame crop sensor, and crop sensors at f2 and the full frames at f1.7. So when it comes to background separation, you've guessed it, the Leica is gonna win. With these cameras both wide open, I think the X100V does get a good level of background separation, just the Q does beat it out slightly. Now both of these cameras are actually surprisingly sharp wide open. It might not be that surprising with the Leica being a Leica, but with the X100V, one of the big improvements over the previous model was the wide open sharpness. When you stop these two cameras down, they're both just clinically sharp. You wouldn't really be able to tell the difference, I don't think, when it comes to performance from kind of f5.6 onwards. When it comes to macro abilities with both of these cameras, they're actually very good. The X100V does have the advantage though, it can shoot at just 10 centimeters away, where the Q is more like 17 centimeters away. And combined with a slightly longer focal length of the X100V, you end up getting far closer in terms of macro. But both of these cameras offer pretty good flexibility. If you're going to be shooting at 10 centimeters, that is pretty extreme. I guess at 17 centimeters on a 28mm, you are still getting pretty good close-ups. Probably the most annoying thing about the Q when it comes to macro is the fact you need to remember to turn the ring on the lens. If you don't do it, it just won't focus up close. It does look really cool when you change it, but the fact that you've got to change it, to be honest, to me, is a bit of a downside. You'll forget sometimes that when you're up close that you need to turn it and it won't focus. Then you'll take a macro photo and then later on you'll forget that you set it and you're wondering why it just won't focus on anything. The other thing with the Q as well is if you do turn it to the macro setting, your close focusing distance improves, but your f-stop means you can only go down to f2.8. The X100V, you don't need to do anything, it can still shoot at f2. So macro wise, the X100V definitely wins. If you're not that into macro, the Q's good enough, to be honest. Whilst we're talking about lens performance then, there's one thing I think we should spend a little bit of time looking at, and that is portraits, because portraits are going to be very important for most people that pick up these cameras. It's important for everyday carries and it's important for travel. If you're not taking pictures of the people you're with, then you're definitely missing out. When it comes to these two cameras, I think the Q wins, partly because of the lens on the front and the full frame. That f1.7 full frame Leica lens knows what it's doing when it comes to portraits. That's not to say the f2 and the Fuji lens just aren't good. They are exceptionally good. They're just against probably the best in the game when it comes to lenses and portraits. Now optically there is one more difference between these two cameras. That's the fact that the Leica Q has stabilisation optically, whereas the X100V has absolutely nothing at all. Now what you'd hope that means is with the Q that I can hand hold it at much slower shutter speeds. So I guess that's what we're going to do now. I'm going to check a load of images up on the screen and I'm going to see what the slowest speed is that I think I can get away with both cameras, and hopefully the Q wins. I guess you're about to see now. So I've added the wide angle converter to the Fuji so that we're shooting both these at the same focal lengths, and I think the point at which they match up is when the Fuji is at 1/15 of a second and the Leica is at half a second, meaning that the Leica is 3 stops better. So it's good to see that optical stabilisation is doing its thing. Now when it comes to autofocus, the setting that I use the most is single point AF. I absolutely love it. I like moving the point around and then just letting the camera focus on the exact thing I've set. Now, both of these cameras are not great when it comes to autofocus. The Q, even though it was great when it came out, is starting to show its age a bit, and the X100V has just never been particularly good, not for a modern camera. Now, a really good example of this is just behind me here. Just here, there is a little rope swing. Now, with the X-H2S that we're recording this on now, it just doesn't miss focus. It knows exactly what we're focusing on, and it doesn't accidentally focus on the background. And we're probably stood, I don't know, 2 meters away. So both of the Q and the X100V just could not focus on this, which is somewhat disappointing and a little bit frustrating. They kept focusing on the background, not the rope swing. Both the X100V and the Q have face detection. The X100V takes it a step further with eye detection, and I find that both of these cameras function pretty well when it comes to these settings. So I think the main takeaway with this is neither of these cameras autofocus is like today's mirrorless cameras. The XH2S is going to blow both of these out of the water. If you're somebody who is going to be shooting like high intensity, fast things, neither of these cameras is probably going to suit your needs. And for me, again, it's perfectly fine because of the photography I'm doing. I'm doing travel photography, I'm doing portraits, I'm doing things that I get to slow down and think about it. High speed photography, neither of these cameras are going to suit your needs. If I didn't warn you guys at the start of this video that it was going to be a long one, I'm sorry, but if you've made it this far, then please consider subscribing. What we're going to look at next though is ISO performance, and before I put them up on the screen, the images, which one do you think is going to be best? You've got the Q, which is full frame, but it is quite a few years old. You've then got the X100V, its crop sensor, the same megapixels, so it's going to have much smaller, I guess they call them photo sites, or whatever they're called. So you'd think the Q's going to be better, but has it aged pretty badly over time? You guys are probably seeing the result up on the screen as we speak. I don't know what's going to win. I think the Q's going to win, but I guess voiceover Adam's probably going to tell you what he thinks wins now. I think the Fuji might actually just about win at 12,800 ISO. It's nice that the Leica can go further and it can go to 25k and 50k, but to me both of those are unusable, so it makes almost no difference. Both of these cameras, 12,800 ISO, I think it's usable, but the winner I honestly do think might be the Fuji. For this next bit, I'm going to need this fence to lean on because it's going to be pretty intense, and I think there's going to be two pretty strong fan groups as well. So let's talk about outputs. First of all, JPEGs, and I think we're actually going to kick this off with the Leica Q. Now the Q doesn't actually have that much that you can change. Inside the JPEG settings, you have saturation, you have contrast, and you have sharpness. You can set like different versions of each, and this is what each of those images looks like. When it comes to the JPEGs out of the Q, I think they have a little bit too much green in them. I think they have so much saturation and maybe a slightly odd hue as well to the greens that often means I don't like the JPEGs that come out of them. But if you can avoid the color green, I think they come out looking very nice, especially portraits, especially if you have a bit of warmth as well in your image. I think the Q really leans into them nicely. When it comes to the X100V, things are very different. The settings for the JPEGs are almost endless, to the point that I can't even bother running through each and every one of them. Built into the Fuji cameras though, you do have a bunch of emulations that all have their own kind of very different color profile. I'll chuck these up on the screen now. As you can see, they are very, very different. Overall, I think the files out of Fuji's come out a little bit too cold maybe on the standard settings, but it's very easy to tweak. You can actually just set a bit of an offset to your white balance that makes it very, very easy to fix. So I think there's going to be two different camps. If you kind of ignore all of the customization you can do and just use the Provia setting in the X100V and the standard JPEGs in the Q, I think maybe the Q just about wins. Where the X100V wins though is the customization. There's also a really big community behind editing different JPEG settings to get different film looks. I'll chuck some of those up on the screen now as well because it's an awful lot of fun, but only if you're interested in spending the time to get to know the settings. If you just want quick, easy, and not to worry about things, then maybe the Q is what you need after all. Hang on. I've just realized I've forgotten something. There's something that's probably even more contentious than color JPEGs. That's the black and white ones. So up on the screen now, I'm going to stick some just standard monochrome JPEGs out of both of these cameras. Again, straight out camera, you know what, maybe I do prefer the Q ones with no settings applied. But again, with the X100V, there's endless settings, endless tweaking you can do. You can get them JPEGs to look exactly like you want them. Overall, the winner for JPEGs for me is the X100V because I love spending a bit of time messing around and customizing them, but I can see the appeal to some people that just want to set black and white or color JPEGs and just be done with it. Next up then, whilst we're still sat here because I can't be asked to move, we're gonna talk video. Now if you are buying either of these two cameras to shoot video, go and have a hard, long look at yourself. You probably shouldn't be shooting video on either of these two cameras, they're not really made for it, but if you're looking at raw specs, the X100V wins this, hands down. You've got 4K 30, you've got 1080p up to 120 frames per second, whereas the Q can pretty much only shoot 1080p 60 at the best. So from that perspective, the X100V specs-wise wipes the floor with the Q. However, I think one thing you've got to bear in mind is probably how practical either of these two cameras are. The Q does have a trick up its sleeve with optical stabilisation. So if you're going to hand-hold video, the Q might be the better one for you. So at this point then, we're getting pretty close to the end. We know which one of these two cameras takes the photos we most like. But the next step is often sharing that image with your phone. Now, I love shooting JPEGs, and being able to quickly get a JPEG from my camera to my phone is actually quite important to me when it comes to an everyday carry camera. Now, these two cameras have two exceptionally different apps. Starting off with the Leica, the app is super easy to use. The connectivity is great. The downside I personally have found with the app is if you have lots and lots of photos on your memory card, the app seems to want to load up a preview of every single image on the card before it will let you transfer something, which means that sometimes you can have to wait a few minutes before it will let you transfer your first image. If you've not got many images on your memory card, then the app is completely seamless. Connecting is easy and sending is nice and quick. When it comes to the Fuji, I don't really know what to say about the app. The actual app and the interface of the app is awful. Like, honestly, so bad. It doesn't feel like it's been made in the last 10 years. The actual functionality, a lot of people struggle to get their camera connected. I personally haven't. I've actually found that pretty easy. And if you get past the clunkiness and feel of the app, I actually think it's pretty good. You can transfer photos really quickly and you have none of that weird preview problem with the Q. One fun comparison is probably how quickly can you do it? If we do a quick timed race then between me trying to get a photo from the Q to my phone against the X100V to my phone, who wins? You guys are probably seeing the result right now. I'm going to see it when I get back to my desk in a little bit. But in an ideal world, you definitely have the look and feel of the Q app with the actual raw kind of speed of the X100V app. I do wish Fuji would update their app. The amount of people that complain about not having the ability to actually connect to the camera at all really needs to be sorted. And I think there are rumours that there is one coming very, very soon. So then, now that I'm back at my desk and I've actually edited this video, which of these two cameras do I prefer? Now, I think we should quickly do a recap going through everything we just went through really quickly. When it comes to the build quality, these two cameras have two very different designs. I don't really have a preference over the sleek modern Leica or the more rugged kind of classic looking X100V. The thing that I do really like about the X100V is the weather sealing. Both of these cameras pack a leaf shutter. Leaf shutters are really cool, and I like the fact that both of these cameras have one. The features on the X100V that do make it stand out a little bit is the ND filter that is built into the lens. It's a 4-stop ND that I personally do get quite a lot of use out. Combined with the leaf shutter that we just spoke about, this camera also has a flash. Now, some people out there will absolutely love the combination of a flash and a leaf shutter. For me though, it's pretty niche and I don't find myself needing that in a camera. But some people out there will absolutely love that, and it might be the decider between these two cameras. Away from that then, we then spoke about the lenses. The 28mm f1.7 is my choice as opposed to the 35mm f2 on the X100V. The main swaying in that decision was predominantly the optical stabilization of this guy is really good. I was actually surprised that it was 3 stops better than non-stabilized. I really like the 28mm focal length. It is my preference. I like the speed and the extra background separation because of that f1.7 and the full frame. When it comes to autofocus, I can barely tell these two cameras apart. I generally use single point autofocus and they're pretty evenly matched. I think the Q might feel a little snappier, but the X100V does have slightly more features with things like eye autofocus that the Q doesn't have. We then spoke about ISO, and I was actually really surprised by this test. I did assume being full frame that the Q would be better. These two cameras, I think in that test were very, very even, and if I had to pick a camera, I actually think the Fuji might have won. But it was very, very close to the point that I don't really think it matters to me. It's kind of nice that the Q goes higher in terms of ISO, but at the higher ISOs, I thought they were pretty unusable. So I think it's a pretty even match there, which is actually a bit of a props to the Fuji. We then spoke about JPEGs, and for me, the X100V is the clear winner. I really like going in and editing all of my JPEG settings to try and emulate different films and going online and kind of getting part of the whole Fuji community. I do see the appeal of the Q though. I think the JPEGs, in their kind of just natural settings, the Q might be slightly better. And I can see why some people don't want to get bogged down and mess around with JPEGs and just want some good JPEGs straight out the camera. And in that case, these two cameras I think are equally good, but maybe the Q is slightly better. But for me, JPEG-wise, the X100V wins. We're going to just ignore video because I don't think either of these two cameras really suit my needs for video at all. We then spoke about the apps that these two cameras have in terms of sending photos to your phone. Neither of them are that great, and time-wise, they're basically the same. I think the X100V was something like 5 seconds quicker. At the end of the day, I'm never going to kind of notice them 5 seconds. Now, I said at the very start of this video that we were not going to talk about cost again, but I think I've got to the point now, for me personally, that these two cameras are very, very even. I really struggle to pick between the two still, even though I've gone through and done all of this testing. Now, I think if these two cameras cost the same, I would keep the Q, but they don't. And because of that reason, and only really that reason, I actually am going to sell the Q, because the X100V is exceptionally close. I don't think it's quite as good as the Q, but the Fuji matches my other Fuji cameras better. It's easier to match the photos, to get like a consistent theme, and I would really like that extra £1,000 that I get from selling it to go into other Fuji kits. So for me personally, I will be selling the Q at some point in the future. I'm not going to rush to sell it, but out of these two cameras, they fill the same void in my camera bag, and the X100V is going to be the camera that fills that void for me. I'd be really interested to know which one of these two cameras that you would pick, I guess ignoring the money element. And if you've got any questions about either of these two cameras, then hit me up down in the comments and I'll be sure to get back to you. But as always, if you've enjoyed this video, please do not forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Cheers.